Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, I'm really excited this week because I'm going to be speaking with a coach who I've been trying to get on the Sports Psych Show for some time now. Before I introduce him, just a little quote I picked up from Twitter. Now, this coach has recently left a big position within English rugby, and one of his players, who had been playing underneath him for some time, said this, and this is what this player put out on Twitter about this coach. This player said, "Every session with this man made my mind feel like it was going to explode. But it taught me how to think outside the box and adapt. Loved having him as a coach and, more importantly, as a mate." Now, I think that quote there was loaded with the kind of things that I love to speak about on the Sports Psych Show. So today I'm going to be speaking with a rugby coach called Warren Abrahams. He's, as he'll attest, no relation to me, so no nepotism there at all. But Warren, it's great to have you on the Sports Psych Show.
Dan, thank you for the invite. Like I said off air, pretty excited, pretty nervous as well. But hopefully I can contribute positively and share some golden nuggets with your audience. But yeah, what a brilliant comment from a player that I was lucky to be part of his journey. And he's pretty successful as one of the best sevens players in the world. So pretty grateful for those words.
Yeah, well, you've let the cat out of the bag. Sevens is in Rugby Sevens. That player is actually a guy called Daniel Bibby. But what a fantastic compliment, as you say, that he gave to you there. And it's, my time doing some stuff in rugby, I heard all about your coaching and the fantastic sessions you'd put on with the England Rugby Sevens there. But I think to get started, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself, mate? Obviously, we now know you're a rugby coach, that you coach the England Sevens, or you used to. So tell us a bit about you, your journey, and we'll take things from there.
Yeah, I'll give you a little snapshot of the whole journey. So originally from South Africa, you probably can tell by the accent. And then grew up in South Africa, in Cape Town in particular, where obviously you are born with a rugby ball on your lap, so I just fell into the sport that way. Always wanted to be involved with rugby. Somehow, I remember the 1995 moment when Nelson Mandela awarded the Rugby World Cup to Francois Pienaar. That was one of my proudest moments, and that's sort of a moment that inspired and created a dream. I always wanted to play for South Africa or coach South Africa. I didn't have, at that stage, I had no concept of coaching, but it looked pretty exciting from the outside. So that's sort of a dream that I carry along with me. Grew up in South Africa. I think I left South Africa at 22. Mm-hmm. Came over to England, took a risk. I didn't have I was in and around the professional stuff, rugby-wise, with South Africa and Western Province, and with my club team I was playing at the time. Didn't quite get the contract I wanted, so I was very naive and young, and I said I'm going to go to England. Had a better savings, still no real concept of where England was sitting in Europe, and had nothing sorted. I jumped on a plane, sent my CV out to a few clubs, rugby clubs in England. And as you know, with the rugby community, there's some pretty good people out there who sort of look after you, and took me in. But one of the first jobs, one of my friends was over in England at the time. He managed to get me a job. The job was selling broadband. And as you know, being from South Africa, I had no clue what broadband was, because the internet at this time wasn't as good as it is now back in South Africa. And I just said, look, I'll take the job, because I needed someone to pick me up from the airport and take me somewhere. And then I learned it was actually internet that I'll be selling. I think I lasted like 24 hours or 48 hours in the job before I got an invite from Windsor Rugby Club at the time, which looked after me.
Right.
And then from there, it was sort of word of mouth in terms of how I spread. But I originally came to play rugby, and I was pretty adamant on chasing this sort of professional dream. But like I said, pretty naive and young. I found myself on the wrong visa, which meant I couldn't play any form of professional rugby. So I was stuck in the national leagues for a long time. But at this stage, I was always coaching. I started coaching the year I left school. I jumped straight into coaching. So the coaching side was always there, and then I picked up some coaching jobs. Eventually went into a few private schools, got my first professional type of role with London Irish. That developed over to Harlequins, and then I sort of got the route through to, I think it was London Irish, Harlequins, coached Lithuania for 2 years, with England Sevens, and now currently in Germany coaching the German national Sevens team. So yeah, that's eventually how I sort of ended up in England, which was just going to be for 6 months, and nearly 13 years later, I'm still there with a beautiful family. So I'm a proper plastic Brit now. That's sort of a snapshot to how I've ended up.
So you left sunny South Africa behind, and you stayed around for the rain in England.
Yeah, what I was doing, I still ask myself that question on a daily basis. I remember in my first year, it was in September, very early on in September, I had a big winter coat on already, my first winter. And the guys were saying, well, we're still in summer, just wait for the weather to properly kick in.
Absolutely. I was going to say that
was a pretty tough one.
That was probably in the 1st of August or something like that, where you were wearing your big thick winter coat. Now, just actually, let's just begin with your playing days, and obviously it sounds like you were a really ambitious young player. And actually, let's just, this is obviously the Sports Psych show, so let's focus on the psych piece here. When you reflect back on your playing days, you think about yourself as a player, in terms of the psychological side of the game, give me a mark out of 10. I'm going to be a real psychologist here and probe.
Yeah.
Give me a mark out of 10 for how good you think you were at the psychological side of the game. And obviously, you can reflect back through the eyes of being a coach now. But give me a mark out of 10 as to how good you were as on the psych side of the game as a player.
As a player, so I was a real rugby nose. I would watch every single game of rugby, every age group. I would study every player. I would have a real good understanding of everything that's sort of going on in the game. I knew every player in South Africa at the time, from seniors to probably under 19. I would say subconsciously I was probably high up. And I actually reflected on this not long ago. Subconsciously, I was probably quite high up. I would probably say around 6, 7,
okay.
In terms of mental skills. But real understanding of what I was doing, I would say probably like 2, 3, 4, real low. And in terms of what I mean subconsciously, it's probably more my upbringing as an individual, because obviously where I grew up and the certain state the country was in terms of the apartheid, still sort of early days of the apartheid, with family dynamics, or sort of my family is not very well off, so you always had to fight a little extra to get something. You had to do a little extra to get where you wanted to go, and always also with obviously the history of the country, that in itself was a challenge. I remember in me and my brother was the first people of color to attend the primary school we attended, so that come with his own challenges in terms of resilience and self-organization and how we had to look after each other. But again, with the rugby community. So in terms of all those little lessons I've learned subconsciously through the way and how to fight that extra little bit more in terms of the rest of my teammates properly, I would say that was quite high, but I know that now. At the time, I had zero concept. So at the time, I just played the game because the game was there in front of me. But one of the big lessons now, looking back as well, I was always one of the coaches, and we'll probably touch on to this guy during the conversation. He always used to say, Warren can do what he wants to do. Warren has sort of got carte blanche. And he'd say to me, just bring the magic, because I couldn't fit into the structure he wanted to play, because I would see different things and I would want to run the ball instead of kicking the ball. So in terms of subconsciously properly, quite high up, really understanding why I was doing what I was doing, I couldn't tell you.
Really,
if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, enormously richly, because I've got a few questions off the back of that. You mentioned that the culture you grew up in, the challenging environment, possibly helped you in your rugby in later years from a mental skills perspective. You mentioned resilience, for instance. Are you a believer in that? Do you feel that how somebody grows up, the challenges they experience in their everyday life, can actually filter onto the pitch or the court or the course?
Yeah, definitely. For me, I'm very grateful for my upbringing, because I think it shaped me into this person I am today, and it shaped me into this type of coach I am. So in terms of all setbacks and how you have to overcome adversity and all these little things that I'm probably more grateful for now than at the time. When I was younger, I give you a good example. So I went to Stellenbosch University. I was quite lucky to go on a scholarship there, and my parents couldn't afford for me to go to university. So I remember straight after school, I was sort of thinking, look, everyone's talking about where they were going to go and what universities they attending. I knew I wouldn't be able to go, so I had to take a year out, and I had to invest all my time in that year to try and make it from a rugby perspective. I knew rugby would open a door for me somehow, so I had to put almost all my eggs in one basket, which I'll learn these lessons over the long run as well. But for instance, when I got to Stellenbosch, I was already enrolled into a course. I wanted to do sports science. When I turned up, they've already enrolled me into sports marketing. But it was the era where transformation had to change within the country. So they were receptive to changing, but what they did, it was we were like 10 people of color at the same time rocked up to undertake these different levels of scholarships, and I was one of the guys. But even in that situation, I remember the conversations was always about who do these people think they are to put us all in this environment and put us in these sort of areas and sort of isolated away. But I saw it as an opportunity. It was a great opportunity because, number one, I'm getting an education I was never going to get. I'm getting a scholarship I would never have, and I knew how hard I had to work during that year off, just playing rugby to try and get this opportunity. So yeah, it was more of an opportunity for me to look at the bigger picture, and all these little things now shape me into sort of the way I think about helping others. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, no, awesome, and I'm going to come back to the mental skills in a second. I know we're honing in on you and your background here rather than coaching per se, but this is interesting because it's how people's past, their experiences, their backgrounds, their cultures, etc. They really do shape. They really do shape how one does things. If you're a coach now, how you do things as a coach, and so you said something really interesting that. Your first coach or a coach of your young years gave you carte blanche on the pitch to do whatever you wanted because you were obviously quite creative, industrious, you'd see things that others wouldn't. Where does the capacity to see things that others don't or can't come from in terms of yourself? Was that a natural thing, do you think? Or was there something you did growing up that helped you to be that way? Or both?
I like to think it's the backyard games we used to invent because we played anything that was going on, and so if it was the Ashes, we would be playing the Ashes with wooden bats and made our own balls and stuff. If it was Wimbledon in the road, there'd be a tennis pitch drawn up, and we'll be playing Wimbledon in the road. Same with Rugby World Cup. There will be different types of games going on, and that would be young, old, all ages. So you were almost forced into situations where you had to do things slightly different. And even when I go see where my dad comes from, my mum comes from, so they are more like rural areas within sort of the outskirts of Cape Town, where poverty is evident over there. So when you go out there, you had to do things slightly differently. So I'd like to think sort of all these little things encompasses the way I sort of see things now. So I would hoping that this is almost like a non-linear way of observing things and noticing things differently. I'd like to almost pride myself on using a non-traditional way of coaching with the way I coach at the minute. In terms of, again, I can't really articulate the answer in probably the best possible way. But one of the phrases I like to notice what other people don't notice. So I sort of almost challenge myself and try and find the little good stuff that people might miss. I don't know. It's quite a difficult one to articulate.
And I think you've done it very well. And what I hear you say, Warren, is that you grew up in an environment whereby you played a lot of backyard games. Those games tend to be multi-sports. It didn't matter what they were. You play multi-sports. It sounds like your environment there were constraints, whether it was from a financial perspective, opportunity perspective. You might not have had the same opportunity to be coached in a traditional way that maybe others within South Africa may have had, but you grew up in that environment that forced you to be creative and forced you to be industrious, and that kind of shaped you into the rugby player that you became. Yeah.
I would say that definitely, just purely because you had. I remember one of the things we used to do. One of my friends was maybe 3-4 years older than me. We used to play against each other the Ashes. Now, when I go bat, he would get me out pretty quickly. When he bats, it would take me ages to get him out. So I had to problem solve. I had to uncover various ways to try and bowl him out. When I go fast, spin, whatever it was, I had to come up with various ways to try and get him out. And then when I go back to the playing, I remember when I'm on the pitch, there'd be a clear structure in terms of you do this from this particular area, and I just couldn't naturally my body wouldn't want to do that because I can see a different opportunity. So I would go for that opportunity, and perhaps maybe that was also my downfall for some coaches where I didn't fit into the way they wanted to play the game. But yeah.
So were you competitive, and would you describe yourself as an artist or a warrior as a competitor? Were you competitive as a kid, or was it more just about creating stuff, creativity, finding solutions to problems?
I would, it's very competitive. I'd probably say in the younger days, especially when I sort of a little bit older and touching on the professional stuff in South Africa, it was more to almost get to this perfectionist side of things, where I remember I used to have a notebook before games, and I would write that the first point would be no mistakes. That would be the first point, no mistakes. And I would measure myself with how many mistakes and stuff I've made within games and stuff, not the good stuff, and obviously measuring myself with how many tries I score, line breaks, and those little bits. But it was all about the zero mistakes. So maybe there was a little bit of maybe I was contradicting myself at the time.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because, on the one hand, you sound like you were this creative, industrious rugby player, growing up playing lots of different sports, real creative, looking at different ways, different angles to find solutions to various problems within your competitive environment. And then there feels like a character who's extremely high conscientious, as you're mentioning, perfectionist, and you're writing things down like don't make mistakes, and that feels like an enormous contradiction there from a characteristic perspective. Creative, perfectionist, compete, play to see different things, find different solutions, but at the same time don't make mistakes. Wow. That sounds an interesting cocktail there.
Yeah, 100%. And I remember in my early coaching days, that was still sort of, because this is sort of how I looked at things. So in my early coaching days, I would have thought a good session was when everything looked neat and there was no mistakes at all. So my reflections and stuff back then as a young coach would have probably been, that was really good because everything looked smooth, everything looked neat. It was a very linear approach. So I had to learn some tough lessons early on to go, hold on, I'm now actually comfortable in this area. I'm more comfortable when I explore and let things go, and I find a different way. So almost touching onto the side where I feel good instead of the side where maybe the chimp was working with me on that side.
Really interesting. So actually, let's now forward towards your coaching career. And it sounds to me like when you started, your philosophy was very in line with what a lot of coaches' philosophies is, which is let's put on a session with a bunch of activities, and I want these activities to look absolutely spot on. That's the definition of great coaching, and that seems like it tapped into that conscientious side of yours, that perfectionist side, and that was what would have felt comfortable at that time. But now it sounds like it's a bit different. Is that the case? And if so, what changed? How did that process of change happen?
I think it's more the obviously how I sort of evolved as a coach and grew and developed and learned through these different experiences. But a big one for me now, in particular at this very moment, I reconnect a lot with my past in terms of where all those backyard game stuff and all those little stuff, I made good connections with that area. That's where my brain works at its very best to come up with different ideas and different stuff. But I remember one of my first roles in England, I had to go for an interview, and I remember these two coaches coaching before me, so we had to go in 1, 2, 3. So I remember these guys coaching. The first one went, and the second one went, and I looked at their sessions. Bear in mind, I had a pretty cool plan of how I was going to deliver this next session, and their sessions looked identical.
Right.
And I sort of looked at it. That was a little light bulb moment, I think, and I looked at it and I go, I'm just gonna have to roll with this. So almost ripped the session plan. I put it in my pocket, and then just rolled with it and had a clear intention of what I tried to get out of it. And the guys loved it because it was totally different. It was not what they were used to doing on a day-to-day basis, or it's not a very traditional session. It didn't quite look like rugby even. So then that's sort of when it started clicking, and sort of the reconnection with my upbringing started growing, and I evolving, and I was obviously, being from South Africa, that's the way I was coached, and that's what I knew about coaching. Coming to England, had a little experience, had a brief little stint in New Zealand, and with all these different countries I'm involved in now. Yep. All these different experiences is molding sort of the way I think about learning and developing people. But I would say back then that was a little light bulb moment for me, where I just look, I don't want to coach the same as every other person is coaching. There must be a point of difference when Warren Abrahams is delivering.
So what's the difference, Warren? What would I see if I was watching a Warren Abrahams activity as compared to what might be called more mainstream? What would be the difference?
It will look obviously very messy. Definitely look messy. I've got some clear principles around that's underpinned by play. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to see these stuff within my sessions. So I sort of broken play down into different words. So my 3 P's would be purpose, positive, and prepare, and then the L would be love and learn. The A would be adaptable, attention, be curious to what's happening, notice all the different stuff. And the Y will always be about my personal why, which is inspiring and developing people. So hopefully when people observe me, they see a high number of positivity. They'll see me being comfortable with being uncomfortable in terms of adapting. It will be playful. There will be a lot of learning. There will be a lot of growing. It will be not your normal tradition type of session. And yeah, it might be mind-blowing for the individuals within there, because I wanna stimulate each individual in different ways. So these are the sort of the principles I like to reflect on when I'm coaching.
It's your framework, essentially. It's your guide.
100%.
Yeah, it's your guide for when you create activities.
Yeah, definitely. So that will guide me through, and that will get me through where I need to be within those sessions.
You use the word adaptable. Would that be the central governor of that model? You want adaptable players?
Yeah, in terms of the players, so it has to be adaptable people that can problem solve and can think for themselves on the field. Because if we remember why we coach these players, we coach them to be able to go in between those 4 lines and do what they're really good at without us shouting instructions. The underpinning one, the one that I'd love to have center of it is love. It is. I feel we got to you got to love every individual we coach. We've got our natural biases with the people we coach. We've got people that's obviously like me. I would gravitate to more towards them.
Yep.
The other guys who's not too comfortable with the chaos stuff, you'd sort of try and stay away. But so love is the ultimate thing for me that I would love to have underpinning every session that I'm involved in.
That's really interesting. So let's unpack that a little bit, if we can. Especially as you said, that's the driver here, because obviously when you're creating your activities, you're obviously you've got that word emblazoned on the forefront of your mind. When you're delivering your activities, you've got that word emblazoned. So when you say love, when we think of relationships with players from a very basic standpoint within sports psychology, we might be talking about a task relationship, we might be talking about a social relationship. So when you use the word love, does that sort of go across task and social? By that I mean task love, as in helping players love the tasks that you're putting on and you want them to focus on, and then from a social perspective, the love from a social perspective. Again, what does that look like? So we've got love from a task perspective and love from a social perspective when it comes to relationships. Can you unpack that a bit for me?
So I hope I'll do it justice. So for me, it's the individual relationship. So yes. It is how I unlock whatever your capabilities is however I create those opportunities for you, my relationship with you, how I maximize your human potential. So I think a lot of coaches, we focus so much on coaching the big picture game in front of us, and then we forget that if you coach sevens, there's 7 individual people in front of you. So so I pride myself on this connection with the people. Now, I don't have special brilliant connections with every player, because it's impossible if you want to be that type of coach. You'd probably not get very far, but that might be, I can be really hard on you when I need to be hard on you, but it could mean that I can put my arm around your shoulder if I need to do that as well, and then understanding who needs what. But in terms of because if you're in a professional environment, these guys come to work, to their job every day. Within England Sevens, we spoke openly about loving each other and creating those memories where they want to do a little bit more. So you, in terms of the task, you can create that level of sort of almost enjoyment in terms of what you're doing. I love beating people. That sort of analogy for a guy like Dan Norton who loves scoring tries. That's why he's the world's leading try scorer. So the more he loves it, the more he'll do it. So you can frame it in sort of all different ways. But for me, ultimately, is how well do I interact and connect with each individual person that I coach. And I mean, Joe Marler made an interesting comment the other day after he played for the Barbarians, where he sort of said, we forget how much he loved the week, how much he loved being in there. This is a guy who's been a professional most of his adult life, and that was one of his most enjoyable weeks. And sometimes we forget about why people come there on a daily basis. So that's sort of how I look at it from the love perspective. And then yes, you can obviously frame it. Your language would probably be slightly different when it comes to the task specific love stuff. But yeah, I'm comfortable with that language.
Do you like your activities to be chaotic? The coaching term would be variability, putting in a lot of variability. You want players to experience chaos. It might look messy from an outside point of view. How do you help players who don't love that chaos, who prefer a more linear design, a more linear form of coaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually experiencing that in Germany at the minute. But I've learned some tough lessons with obviously I'm at the coaching spectrum. Discover, explore. I would be biased to the Discover, explore side because that's where I'm very good at. But I remember one of the lessons I've learned. I was out with a young English team in I think it was last year in the Europeans, a really young team. Now, a fresh new team. We just put them together 2 days before the tournament. We had like 3 schoolboys in there as well. So these guys obviously had no real understanding of how England Sevens play. Number one, their Sevens knowledge is fairly low as well. And perhaps on day one, I wanted to explore a little too much. So in terms of the learning, maximizing learning, obviously explore and discover is a nice long-term process. Over the long run, you'd make people ridiculously good at what they do. And perhaps on day one, I went exploring too much, which you could see how the level of learning slowed down. So that was a good reflection for me, which meant on day 2, I had to be more directive. So a little bit more uncomfortable for me to tell them a bit more and give them more guidance and being a little bit more explicit with them. So that was a tough lesson I learned there and then in terms of how to go up and down on this coaching spectrum between sort of the chaotic side and a more clear guidance and directions and almost take a little bit of stuff away. And then I find that process in Germany at the minute as well, where obviously it's a big shock to the system for someone coaching the way I'm coaching. So I had to strip some of my sort of core games down a little bit and maybe add 1 or 2 little constraints in to make it easier for there's one guy in particular who said to me the other day, said because I like the vulnerability aspect where I always ask the guys, how do you feel about that session? What do you think? How do I change? How do I get better? Because that's a quick little hot feedback for me to get better next time. And he said, sometimes I feel he's a maths student,
Yeah.
So he has a big degree, and he said sometimes I feel all the conditions come or the constraints are coming at once. So my brain can't process that. So maybe you can just do one at a time. So I had to think of different ways to make it more the activity more accessible for his level of learning, although he's probably one of the brightest guys, but he learns totally differently. So this is an interesting challenge. So at the minute, I almost it's still very thought-provoking, and a lot of thinking is required within the sessions, but I've probably stripped it down a little bit, where I would say, for instance, with England Sevens, I would do games within games. So at the minute, I'm just maybe doing the games and adding little bits before I add the other different element to the game. That's another game separately from the game.
So what I hear you say, the 2 words that pop into my mind are culture and context. So culturally in Germany, now coaching the German Sevens side, perhaps your variability, chaos, messiness conflicts a little bit with a Germanic culture mentality, maybe, and obviously there would be a whole heap of individual differences within that culture. So cultural differences, contextual differences, and I suppose my question there would be, when you were coaching the England Sevens and you were at a tournament like, say, the Hong Kong Sevens, a day or 2 before a game, would you become more directive? So if you've got that continuum that you alluded to earlier, which was non-directive to directive, would you be more directive going into a game a day or 2 before a game?
Yeah, so another one I had to learn some tough lessons on in terms of my approach of how I sort of then periodize and plan the week to not make it because sevens is obviously, as you know, sevens is all about the mental capacity, switch on, switch off. It's emotions is up and down, and the level of thinking, and if you're not really good with your emotional control and really understand the mental switch on, it's a lot of information that comes in. So I had to, obviously early on in the week, the sessions would look slightly different to later on in the week, just purely because of knowing what these guys are going to face, knowing how much information they can process, understanding where, because sometimes I would be tempted to go, I've noticed something in the game, I would just want to add a little something to spice it up in the warm-up, and then I would go, okay, that's not going to be the right place to do that particular thing, or I had to do it slightly in a almost a lesser thinking way, where they can perform these actions without accessing that unnecessary brain power.
Yep.
So they're always ready for the game. So yeah, early in my 7 days, I'd probably say when I coached Lithuania, I would just roll with it. We were pretty successful. I don't know how, reflecting back on how I sort of did things with them, we would just go, and I would still be very chaotic and in what they call the captain's run, or the last session before the tournament. But these are the sort of lesser hard lessons I had to learn in terms of, but again, it's player feedback. When you're open and comfortable with having those conversations, someone might just go in your ear, I think that was a little bit too much for me. And if you look at it, and he's one of the most senior players in the team, and it's too much for him, then you're wondering, wow, I wonder how that 18, 19-year-old is feeling then, if I sort of went so chaotic. So yeah, I learned some pretty hard lessons with that.
In terms of learning hard lessons, you mentioned a word a few minutes ago, vulnerability. A very scary word for coaches. And after you mentioned that word vulnerability, you talked about allowing players to give you feedback on your coaching style, your coaching communication, anything about you as a coach, your behaviours, etc. I'm going to make a comment here, and I just want you to, if you come back at me and comment yourself. Vulnerability is a very scary word for coaches, because I suppose it relates to the loss of power, and coaching feels like a power profession, being in control, being above the players. So I love what you say about vulnerability, but your thoughts on vulnerability and power, and what stops coaches from expressing vulnerability?
Yeah, I just, it's like you say, sometimes there's perhaps an element of ego involved with the coaching. For me personally, I feel that it's the best level of learning I'm getting when I'm involving the players, and I can stand up in front of them and go, look, I got that totally wrong there. I got the selection wrong. I maybe got the subs wrong. My preparation was completely wrong there, so I apologize. When I feel when you give that level of empowerment to a group of players, you'll get more back from them. That's sort of how I see things. But again, it comes down to who you are and how you are as a coach. I'm comfortable with being in uncomfortable situations. With England Sevens, we always spoke about being the best in the world, and I suppose I looked at that, and it was, for me, if I want to be the best coach in the world, I'm going to get the best feedback from the guys that I coach. Now, sometimes the feedback is not always the best feedback, but if I can ask something and they'll give me the right answers, it might be the best for that. But I do feel that there's sometimes, from a coaching perspective, there's sometimes an element of ego, because we always say to players, you got to do extra, you got to do more, you got to do less of that, you got to do less of that. But we never look in the mirror sometimes and go, you know what, mate, you might not have to use those words when you speak at halftime, or that's probably not the best way to motivate your group. Those type of behaviors. But I mean, vulnerability for me would be a great skill for a coach if you wanna push on and if you want to take your teams to new levels.
For me, Warren, listening to you and reflecting on vulnerability, I think it helps a coach have what we in psychology call an internal locus of control. It's a terrible, terrible term. I apologise, but it comes from
definitely.
Yeah,
it's definitely too big for me.
No, well, it comes from a theory from the 1950s called attribution theory. A psychologist called Julian Rotter, and internal locus of control. So internal control is when you feel that you have control of your internal mechanisms that can positively impact your experiences within the world, essentially. So you're in charge. You're in charge of your experiences. You're in charge of how you perceive the world around you, and it aligns to successful people tend to have an internal locus of control, whereas unsuccessful people tend to have an external locus of control. They might blame others or attribute others for failings, rather than you saying, hey, look, I'm vulnerable here. What can I do to get better? This is about me. I made a mistake here. They point fingers at others and they say, well, that's not me. It's you, the players. And that's always usually for me a real weakness within coaching.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think we sometimes in the coaching world, we're afraid of what we might find out. We're afraid of how we would be exposed at these different weaknesses or development areas that we have. But if these are not uncovered, it's almost, I heard this analogy yesterday where on a podcast that someone had this ridiculously smell in their house come out of the carpet, but they used to, what they did 3 or 4 times, they would clean the carpet and they bring the cleaners in and they clean the carpet but the smell would stay there. It would just stay there, but it's clean. And eventually one day the guy just said, I can't take this anymore. He ripped the carpet out, ripped everything out, put on brand new stuff in, and guess what? The smell went away. So sometimes we just gotta rip the carpet completely out and press the reset button and go again. I mean, I remember one of the biggest moments for me in my coaching career, and it will forever be at Harlequins. We lost one of our young academy players, Sep Adenoran Alula, who unfortunately a few years ago committed suicide. And I mean, that was one of the toughest moments I've ever experienced as a coach, especially coaching this young academy player, being part of his journey, but not really uncovering what triggered these behaviors, or even knowing that he was suffering in the way he was suffering. Not just did I coach him, I was actually playing at Richmond at the time, and he was actually one of my teammates as well. And I remember not long before the accident, we were even rooming together. And I had such an important role to play in his development. But in terms of I couldn't see these behaviors. So you question yourself a lot. So I feel the more open and vulnerable we can be as coaches, the more we might be able to uncover these type of behaviors, and we might see more. So that is sort of my view when I look at how vulnerable we can be as coaches sometimes, or the benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Rugby, whether it's the sevens version, the 15s, the full game. You know, Warren, surely it's a physical game. It's a game of smashing the opposition. It's it's a game of the body. How is it a game of the mind as well? You've briefly mentioned a few things there, but how is rugby psychological? In what way?
In what way for me? I mean, I said earlier, there's the stat that's flowing about that the game's 80% above the shoulders, or some coaches would even argue it's higher than that. So I use one of my the coaching principles that I use is always coach from the head down. So I'd like to coach. I coach from the head down. I would want to. Hence why I deliver the sessions the way I deliver my sessions, because I want to get as much in there from the cognitive side as I possibly can get, because ultimately the game is about making multiple decisions, or what they say at the high level is intelligent decisions in split seconds. So if we spend all our time coaching from the feet up and spending so much time on the technicalities of the way you have to do things, I'd want to flip it around and look at more perception, action, look at the mental side of the game. How well do people understand why they do what they do? Again, I mentioned earlier with England Sevens, it's probably one of the, if not one of the best programs in the world in terms of the mental side of the game, because the foundation of the program is from the head down. So our mental skills coach, Katie Warren, have done an amazing job there in terms of how we prepare young players, first of all, in terms of understanding. I think we use the blue and red head model as well, by understanding their brain, understanding individuals, our more seasoned campaigners understanding what makes them good, and what triggers certain red behaviors, and how to deal with these things. So from her, I've learned, informally, I've learned over the last 4 years, I've learned a hell of a lot that made me, I was always keen to sit into these little conversations anyway, and workshops and everything we did, because I just felt informally I became a better coach. So from a mental skills perspective, that should form, because if we talk about people, if we want to make people better, that should form the basis of everything we do. The more we prepare people better to go and perform, the better our athletes will be. Because sometimes I think there's too much of an isolation between the rugby player and the person, but also an isolation into the technical and tactical stuff of rugby that you need to know. But ultimately, you only perform on a Saturday afternoon or whenever you play if the brain allows you to do things that you need to do. So for me, it's probably the most important thing in professional sport, I would say, or not even professional sport, in general. The more we can prepare people better, the more we'll get out of our athletes.
The vast majority of my work is in football, soccer. I've done a little bit in rugby, but one thing I always say to coaches of soccer is that soccer might work in seconds, but the brain and the nervous system work in milliseconds. And so the brain and the nervous system trump soccer for speed every single time, even though it's this very quick, instinctive sport. The brain and the nervous system is constantly working underneath and sort of sending out thoughts and feelings, judgments, as a competitor is playing. I suppose in many respects that whilst rugby is different to soccer, pace is still enormously high, isn't it? Especially at sevens level. And it's got to be that those, when you think about the sevens that you're coaching in Germany, that you've coached in England and you've coached throughout your career, and you reflect on their brain and the nervous system of those players is working in milliseconds, and it's constantly throwing out judgments, thoughts, feelings all the time, judging what's going on around them, judging the score, judging the opposition. For me, that's where, from a performance psychological perspective, that's where these invasion team sports, that's where the psychology stems from in many respects.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree with that, because that's where we need these guys or girls to be able to perform in critical pressured situations constantly. And then I hear this a lot. Coaches would go, yeah, but they can't do that. They can't do that. They can't do this. They never do that in that situation. They never do this. And I'm thinking, hold on. So maybe we need to look back at how do we practice this down? How do we create these scenarios for these people to be able to perform in that particular way? What sort of stuff are we doing away from the game to help them perform to the levels they need to perform? And those are all the cool little challenges that we can set with our mental skills coaches. I mean, do we even prepare these guys to realize when they feel certain feelings within certain situations, what that feeling might be, and what side of the brain that will be triggering? But not if we don't educate our players, they will never be able to adapt in those situations. And like we said earlier, rugby is about adapting to every picture that's in front of you, every scenario. If we just focus it from a rugby perspective, you only get that certain aspect and certain actions and certain behaviors. But if we look at it more deeper from a cognitive side, different behaviors might emerge that all of a sudden together complementing each other. Someone will perform a totally different action that you've never seen before, or he might react totally different in scenarios. And it's always fascinating when you see the work going into. So if I look at with the England Academy players, for instance, I would look at, so Dubai would normally be your first tournament of the season, so they're all fresh into learning these new stuff about the brain, and learning how to switch on and switch off. The switch off is always the easy part, because they can do that very, very well. But getting them back ready is always the challenge. But if you watch these young people develop over the course of the year, and then we had one last year, one kid, Will Meir, he went to the Rugby World Cup, Sevens World Cup, before he even played on the World Series, before he even made his debut. So he made his debut for England at a Rugby World Cup and played in a World Cup semi-final. So, but the work we put in beforehand with this individual for him to be able to perform at a high level he just got the England Player of the Year. And these are the brilliant things, and then you can see at the benefit of having a world-class mental skills program.
Well, I love what you said earlier about, because you mentioned practice design, activity design, and obviously you've also been talking about mental skills. And for me, I think sometimes coaches can be a bit guilty of saying, oh, that person can't perform under pressure, so we need to have mental skills here, or we need to bring in the sports psych. And then maybe, if I may say at the moment, there are groups of coaches who might say, well, we don't really need mental skills, we just do this through the practice design. And I'm kind of sitting here looking at both groups and going, look, you're both right. you're both right, but what's the most powerful combination? What's the most powerful cocktail here? And the most powerful cocktail is the kind of practice design, the kind of activity design that puts players under pressure, that stretches them, that constrains them, that demands certain things from them from a behavioural perspective, and to help players have these mental skills as well, so they can practice, so they can use them and practice them within these activities, within this practice design. So when you fuse the two together, that to me is the most powerful combination, a really powerful cocktail of learning and development.
Yeah, no, I've had first-hand experience with that. If I just from a coaching perspective, in terms of how we did one tournament where Katie Warren was traveling with us, and just purely as an observer and a supporter. And every now and then she'll plant something in my head. And every now and then she'll have little conversations with guys. So I'll be doing all the coaching, leading on all the coaching, and she would basically just support. It was a sort of a conscious development tool, where she would just be out there supporting the team, ultimately performing a role without anyone knowing she's performing a role. And that's sort of the best learning I got as a coach, where if you combine everything together, and she's from a mental skills perspective, the amount of golden nuggets I sort of picked up throughout the week, and I might say something or question or challenge the team in different ways, and she would just prompt me with a question in a different way, but not expecting an answer, and then I'd walk away and go, oh, okay, yeah. So next time, different scenario, I would just ask things slightly differently. But yeah, if there's even to the extent where one of the things we did a lot before the World Cup, for instance, with England, was how we used the bench. So Katie did a lot of work around what these guys doing on the sideline. So we'd be actively delivering, and it'd be, are they watching the game tactically? So are they coming onto the field and then give tactical information into the team in terms of their behaviors? What sort of stuff are we shouting on? Because sometimes on the bench people like to shout stuff on. So what is it positive reinforcement, or if you've got a thought that probably shouldn't leave your lips, you might need to keep that thought for yourself. And it's all almost creating another 5 coaches on the sideline. But these are, in terms of how you spoke about fusing things together. With Harlequins in the academy, for instance, there was a young sort of an intern, Zoe Taylor, who's fairly new onto her journey, and she's learning and developing a lot. So it was cool to have different type of challenging conversations with her in terms of, remember, you're not just a psychologist, or you're not there on the side. I need you to be here on my shoulder so we can make these guys better together. So always look at fusing the two together, because like you say, it's a powerful tool when you can build this hybrid player who can perform and execute stuff from a skills perspective, but from a mental skills perspective, they can constantly perform at a very high level.
I have one more question. You gave yourself a mark out of 10. You gave yourself 6 out of 10. Maybe 7 out of 10. 6.5. We'll call it 6.5 out of 10 for for your mental skills when you were a young player.
Subconsciously. Yeah.
Well, this is the question, which brings everything neatly together, because you said, well, subconsciously, which relates to the environment you grew up in, the culture you grew up in, helped you become resilient, etc., etc. But then you said, well, from what I knew about the mental side of the game, about 2 or 3. So my final question is, do you think players do you think it can help a player to be really invested and engaged in the mental side of the game, even those who are perhaps would deem themselves to be naturally quite good like you did? Would it be important for those players to actually say, yeah, look, I'm quite good at this, but I could be even better because I don't know enough. I do this naturally well, but I don't know enough about the mental side of the game. So actually this can help me improve. Do you think that that's important, perhaps an important journey for a player, even who's good at the mental side, to go on?
It's probably the most important thing. Now, I always looked at it quite differently. So if you look at rugby, so I always look at, so if I take the environment, so I was at Harlequins and I was at England Sevens, two vastly different mental programs.
Yeah.
So very much different. So what happens quite a lot is with the mental skills stuff, and you probably got experience in, and when there's an issue, they get told to go talk to someone or want to go talk to someone. When it's all rosy and we're winning, and then there's no issues. So it's how we present this mental skills program. So it has to be. If you're in an environment where it's where they sell the product in that particular way, you're always gonna. I don't think, and I've seen it firsthand. There's no real benefit of transforming a program or team if basically you're just sitting on the outside. You're just the extra member, but you're not actively involved. Because remember, in those situations, scenarios when you are gonna, so they say Dan Abrams is here today, 2:00 we're gonna go to Dan's session. What's gonna happen naturally is gonna be, I can't be dealing with it. But pretty much because the program and the environment suggests this is what we think about the mental skills program. And then I flip it around and I refer back to with the England Sevens one. It was quite an exciting, refreshing one because we understood that the success of the program is underpinned by the way we all think as individual people, and it would go and now. Obviously easier from a sevens perspective because it's smaller numbers of people. Where in 15s, it's bigger squads. There's more. There's a lot more people. So the dynamics and the complexity of everything changes quite vastly. But how we even would prepare for a tournament, it would be underpinned by our mental skills program. So all the goals and all the how we get our ready for our behaviours, what sort of stuff. So for instance, playing at Twickenham, at your home tournament, in front of your family, and then playing in Dubai, for instance, those are two very different stuff, and it would require different mental skills. Because your home tournament, obviously your whole family, your kids and everyone is there watching you. So what sort of behaviors will that trigger? How would you, when would you jump in red? What sort of stuff? And these stuff would be all within the program, the season program, forms the foundation. So we'd have meetings about how it goes. So when we come to game day and this stuff is on the board, you can see the red triggers is up there. These stuff might trigger us. So if that happens, how are we going to support that individual? These are the stuff that will excite us, this tournament. But it's not just, we didn't just do it there and then. This is like a 4-year, 5-year program that's evolving and everyone's excited. So for me, and again, referring back to that tough lesson I've learned with young Sebi, the importance of having these mental skills programs, but not just the mental skills program to tick the box, the mental skills program to transform our players is imperative for me. Even from a coaching side, it shouldn't just be. I always ask the question when you know how the young interns come and they would join the academy. My first question is, how are you going to make me a better coach? that will always be my first question out there, because I want it to be, you make me a better coach, we'll make those players better, and we'll create better people here. So to answer your question in a nutshell, with all that waffling, it is underpins everything we do. I would be my view.
Wow, very well said, and I think a wonderful place to finish on. No waffling at all. I think that was absolutely fascinating, and we certainly speak from the same song sheet, that's for sure. And I'm sure you would have captured the attention of many people listening in who will think very similar and will want to tap into your expertise. So how can they do that, Warren? Do you have, I know you have a Twitter, so what's your handle, and how can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, so you can either get in touch by email. It's just coachingforpotential@outlook.com. So any questions or anything, please feel free to just drop me a note, or anything around sort of mentoring and supporting and coaching and that type of stuff. It's all on there. On social media, Twitter, it's at W_Abrams, and my Instagram is at WA Coaching for Potential. And on these stuff, I put a lot of different stuff out there for coaches to have a look at, different challenges myself to try and come up with a lot of new different stuff to improve learning and improve the players' mental capabilities. So yeah, it's all out there. I just stick it out there because I want to help as many people as I possibly can. But yeah, just drop me a line there anywhere, and I can update a little more of how we can support each other.
Well, thank you so much, Warren. Everyone, that was Warren Abrahams. Thank you so much for your time. That was great.
Thank you very much for having me.
It was absolutely fantastic. I know I took a whole bunch of notes and plenty to reflect on. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you, the audience, did too. If you've got any feedback for me, please do get in contact, whether it's via Twitter or Facebook or any one of my social media platforms. Please let me know what you think. If you've got any suggestions for guests for future shows, please let me know. I'm certainly looking forward to next week's show. Bye for now.